Little Richard's story will break your heart. While Elvis was hailed as king, Richard was losing millions of dollars in bad contracts and Pat Boone was getting rich by copying his songs. Richard couldn't even walk through the front doors of the venues he headlined. Today we show the dark side of rock and roll's birth, showing how racism and greed in record labels almost destroyed the man who started it all, and why he had to sue for $12 million to get a small part of what he deserved. Richard Wayne Pennon was born on December 5th. Born in Montgomery, Georgia in 1932, his birth certificate changed his name from Ricardo to Richard. He was the third of 12 children in a strict and complicated family. His father, Charles Bud Pennon, was a church deacon but also ran a nightclub and made money by selling illegal alcohol. Music was a big part of his life. His family was very religious and church was a big part of it. His grandfather and uncles were preachers, and the family went to a lot of different churches, from Baptist to Pentecostal. Pentecostal churches, though, were the ones that really got him excited. The worship was strong, the singing was loud, and Richard fell in love with it. By the time he was 10, people in his community thought he was a faith healer, because he would go around singing gospel songs and praying for the sick, and people would swear they felt better after he touched them. Sometimes they even gave him money. Church also gave him his first experience performing. He had a voice that couldn't be ignored. His voice was so loud and powerful that he was once told he couldn't sing in the choir anymore because he was screaming and hollering too much. But that's how he sang, and later that same wild, uncontrollable voice would make him a rock and roll legend. When Richard wasn't in church, he was listening to other kinds of music. In 1947, when he was only 14, he was in a car accident that changed his life. When gospel star Sister Rosetta Tharpe heard him singing outside of the Mon City Auditorium, she was so impressed that she asked him to open her show. Not only did he get to perform, but she also paid him. If she thought he was good enough, then maybe he could be something. But just as he was figuring out who he wanted to be, his home life fell apart. His father didn't like how Richard behaved or what he thought about his son's behavior. By the time Richard was 13, his father had had enough of his sexuality and threw him out. It was a horrible experience. He was still a child, but now he had to live on the streets and grow up quickly. He did anything he could to get by, but one thing never changed. He kept singing and looked for places to perform, no matter what kind of place it was. By the time he was 16, he was in a whole new world. Dr. Newbillow's traveling show. It was crazy and strange, and nothing like church. A baby preserved with clawed feet and tiny horns was one of the show's attractions. Anything could happen, and Richard loved it. This is where he learned how to be more than just a singer. He learned how to perform. He learned how to keep people's eyes on him the whole time. He started wearing capes and turbaned himself. He started pushing things even further. He even started dressing in drag under the stage name Princess Levon, and on that stage he could be as loud as he wanted to. Little Richard thought he had made it when he was 18. He signed a deal with RCA Victor, which was one of the biggest record labels at the time. This was supposed to be his big break, but it turned out to be a disaster. On March 31, 1951, he released his first single, Every Hour. It was a small hit in Georgia, and his father, who had never liked his music, started playing it on the jukebox at his nightclub for the first time. That was it for his next songs, Taxi Blues. RCA Victor. He wasn't promoting his music enough, and the songs didn't sound like him. He was recording slow blues tracks that didn't match his energy. He wasn't the wild, electrifying performer he was born to be. He was just another singer with forgettable songs. In February 1952, RCA Victor dropped him without a trace, and his music career was over before it even began. He had to find work, so he started washing dishes at the Greyhound bus station in Monmouth, Georgia, but even there, at first his co-workers told him to quiet down, but after a while they started to cheer him on, telling him he was too good to be washing dishes. He kept performing in small clubs, house parties, and even on the streets. He was loud, flashy, and full of energy. One night, at the TikTok Club, he met singer Lloyd Price, who told him about a record label called Speciality Records. That conversation would change everything. On September 14, 1955, when he walked into J&M Studio in New Orleans, he had been performing a song for years that always got the crowd going. The chorus had lines like, "Tutti frutti good booty," and "If it don't fit, don't force it," which were way too dirty for radio. The producer, Bump Blackwell, called in a songwriter named Dorothy Lustry to clean it up. She quickly changed the words to "Tutti frutti oh Rudy," which had the same energy but was better for radio. Then the real magic happened the first time they tried to record the song. When Richard got angry about the song not sounding right, he slammed the piano, screamed into the mic, and let loose. The energy exploded and his voice was so strong that the studio engineers had to move the microphones back so they wouldn't break in just 15 minutes. Tutti Frutti was recorded, and when it came out in October 1955, it changed music forever. It went to number 2 on the R&B charts and even made it to the pop charts, which was a big deal for a black artist in the 1950s. As his fame grew, so did his. After Tutti Frutti, he had hit after hit. He wore a lot of makeup, lined his eyes with eyeliner, and wore his hair in bright sequined and silky styles that got people's attention. In 1956, he released Long Tall Sally. He knew that a white singer named Pat Boone would try to cover it, like he did with Tutti Frutti, so Richard recorded it as quickly as he could. Boone couldn't keep up, and Richard's version became the one that everyone remembered. The song went to number 1 on the R&B charts, and became his signature song. More hits followed, including The Girl Can't Help It All, Slipping and Sliding, and Rip It Up. In 1958, he released Good Golly Miss Molly, another crazy high-energy song that became famous. From 1956 to 1959, Little Richard had 17 top 40 R&B singles and 9 top 40 pop hits. He wasn't just making music, he was shaping rock and roll. His music brought black and white audiences together at a time when America was still deeply segregated. Little Richard was on top of the world. In 1957, he had hit after hit, was making $10,000 a week, and had sold over 32 million records. His concerts were packed, his music was everywhere, and his career couldn't have been bigger. Then, out of the blue, on October 12, during a huge show in Sydney, Australia, he shocked everyone by walking off the stage and saying he was done. His fans were shocked. His band lost their jobs, and his record label, which had just spent a fortune promoting his latest song, Keep a Knockin', couldn't believe it. The craziest part was that he had. The reason he made the decision was just as dramatic as the announcement itself. He was flying from Melbourne to Sydney when he saw what he thought was a fireball streaking across the sky. He thought it was a sign from God, but it turned out to be the Russian satellite Sputnik-1. When he got off the plane, he learnt that the plane he was supposed to take had crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Fear, guilt, and a deep sense of what he had done. He felt like something bigger was going on, and he was sure he had to change his life to show his devotion. He took off 4 $8,000 diamond rings and threw them into Sydney's Hunter River, saying he was leaving rock music to serve God. In late 1957, when he was only 25, he started studying theology at Oakwood College. He took his religious change very seriously, telling his students that his old music was the work of the devil and offering to buy back their records so he could destroy them. Despite being excited about his new path, he wasn't always a good student. He missed a lot of classes and could be loud and disruptive when he did show up, but the school let him because they knew that just having him there gave them prestige. He stayed at Oakwood until 1959, and even formed a gospel group called the Quad Quartet. They went on tour on the weekends and made $500 per concert, but Richard's love of luxury meant that most of that money was spent on expensive things. In between 1959 and 1962, he recorded 3 gospel albums: God is Real, Pray Along with Little Richard Volume 1, and Pray Along with Little Richard Volume 2. At the same time, he started the Little Richard Evangelistic Team and began traveling across the country to preach and sing gospel. His larger-than-life personality made him a powerful preacher, and his ability to combine fiery sermons with high-energy gospel performances drew huge crowds. But Richard's biggest battle wasn't just with music. Between rock and gospel, he had always struggled with guilt over his sexuality. He grew up in a very religious home in Macon, Georgia, and his feelings for women and men changed all the time. In 1984, he said, "Sex to me is like a smorgasbord. Whatever I feel like, I go for." At other times, he called homosexuality unnatural and sinful. His marriage to Ernestine Harvin in 1959 lasted only 4 years, and many people thought that was the real reason for their split. In 1962, just before going back to rock music, he was arrested for approaching men in a bathroom. In later years, his views on sexuality kept changing. At one point he told Penthouse magazine, "I've been gay my whole life." But in 2017, in an interview with a Christian network, he said that homosexuality was completely wrong. No matter how hard he tried to reconcile the two sides of his life, the struggle never really went away. In 1962, after 5 years away from rock music, he was arrested for roll. Richard shocked everyone by coming back. He was having money problems, and the strict life of a religious figure was wearing him down. But British promoter Don Arden told him that his records were still selling well in Europe, and that fans were dying for him to come back, so he couldn't say no. His comeback show at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton, England, was a huge success. But what made the tour even more famous was that the Beatles opened for him. The Beatles were huge fans of Richard. His famous "Woo" in Long Tall Sally was copied by Paul McCartney. During the tour, Richard gave them advice and even helped Paul improve his voice. The tour took them to Hamburg, Germany, where 16-year-old Billy Preston joined Richard's band and would later work with the Beatles in their last years. Richard's comeback was a huge success, but it also caused a lot of controversy. Many of his religious followers felt betrayed by the church community that had supported him before. Although the tour made him famous all over again, Richard didn't care. He jumped right in and released Bama Lama Bama in 1964, which did well in the UK but not at all in the US. He signed with VJ Records and put out a new album called Little Richard Is Back, hoping to win over the new generation of music fans. But times had changed, and British rock bands were taking over, and labels like M-Town and Stax were dominating the charts. No matter what he did, he couldn't get back to where he was before. It looked like things were finally getting better when he signed with Reprise Records and put out The Real Thing, which mixed rock with funk and soul. The single Freedom Blues made it to number 47 on the Billboard Hot 100, which was the highest it had been ranked since 1958. Critics liked the album, but it didn't sell as well as he had hoped. While he was trying to stay relevant in music, he was also struggling with a much worse problem: addiction. By 1975, he was hooked on cocaine, heroin, and PCP, and he later admitted that he was spending up to $1,000 a day on drugs. He said that every time he blew his nose, blood and pieces of flesh would come out. He was also struggling with his faith and his sexuality. In 1984, he said that homosexuality was not natural, but in 1985, he admitted that his father had kicked him out when he was 15 because he was gay. He kept going back and forth, never fully at peace with himself. Then, in 1977, something happened that shook him to the core. His friend Larry Williams pulled a gun on him over a drug debt. When his brother and two close friends died, along with his comeback show with the Beatles, he stood in front of a crowd and said he was done with rock and roll. Movies and TV, on the other hand, gave him a new way to connect with people. In 1986, he played a crazy neighbor in Down and Out in Beverly Hills, which was a hit and made over $62 million at the box office. But the song he wrote for the movie, called Great Gosh, was the real highlight. It was a big hit, and he became a regular TV guest in 1982. He was on Late Night with David Letterman and made headlines when he said, "God gave me the victory. I'm not gay now, but you know I was gay all my life." This was another example of the inner battle he always seemed to be fighting. In 1969, he even went on a Monkey TV special to stay in the public eye. In 1955, Little Richard signed a contract with Specialty Records, but it turned out to be one of the worst deals in music history. In history, he was only promised 50 cents for every record sold. That meant that when Tutti Frutti sold 500,000 copies, he only made $225,000. At the time, white artists usually made between 3 and 5% of their sales. But it wasn't just the low royalties that hurt him. Art Roop, the owner of Specialty, bought the publishing rights to Tutti Frutti for just $50. This meant that Richard missed out on all the money that song would make in the future. What's worse, his songs were some of the most important in rock and roll history, and this clause cost him a lot of money. Richard later explained why he had agreed to such an unfair deal. He was young, poor, and had never been in business before. His father had died and his mother was raising 12 kids. He just wanted to help his family, so he took whatever he was offered because he didn't know any better. But this wasn't just happening to him, it was happening to all black artists. Record companies often gave them bad deals because they knew they had fewer options and couldn't really fight back. As Richard's music became more popular, it became clear how much money he had lost. Songs like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly were huge hits and helped create rock and roll. White artists covered them, movies used them, and radio stations played them all the time, but Richard didn't get to keep much of the money because of his contract. While Specialty Records and others made millions off of his music, he got almost nothing in return. It wasn't just the lost royalties that hurt Richard. His music influenced artists from the Beatles to Prince, but he wasn't paid for it. Even when Tutti Frutti sold 3 million copies by 1968, he had only made a tiny fraction of what he should have. After decades of being taken advantage of, Richard decided to fight back in 1984, almost 30 years after leaving Specialty Records. He sued them. He sued for $112 million, saying they had been withholding royalties for decades. His lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was also about showing how the industry had used and thrown away black artists. The battle went on for 2 years, bringing attention to how unfair the industry had been to its pioneers. In 1986, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but it was clear that Richard didn't get anywhere near the $112 million he had originally sought. Even after winning the lawsuit, his financial problems didn't go away. While the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and other stars who were influenced by him became rich, Richard was still having a hard time. His records weren't getting enough attention, and record labels weren't pushing his new music. Even though he had a huge impact, his earnings never matched it. Because of this, Richard had to keep performing just to stay alive. Unlike other rock legends who made millions from record sales, he had to rely on live shows. Touring wasn't a choice, it was his only way to stay alive. Richard had to deal with racism everywhere he went on tour. He couldn't stay in the same hotels as white performers, and some venues wouldn't even let him walk through the front door. In the South, his concerts were segregated, and black fans had to sit in separate sections, sometimes in the balcony, while white fans had better seats. In 1957, when he was at the height of his fame, he arrived at a major venue and was told he had to use the service entrance. Even though he was the star of the show, he wasn't allowed in the main areas. Instead of keeping quiet, Richard spoke up, saying, "I may be Little Richard, but I've got a big voice and I won't be silenced by your small minds." No matter how famous he became, he was still treated less than white rock and roll stars. While white rock and roll stars played in the biggest venues, Richard was stuck on what was called the Chitlin Circuit, which was made up of clubs and theaters across the Eastern. During a time when segregation kept black performers out of mainstream venues, he played at famous places like the Royal Peacock in Atlanta and the Apollo Theater in Harlem. But the difference between how he was treated at home and abroad was shocking. In the US, racism still limited him. But when he toured Europe in 2962, he was treated like a king. Crowds packed the venues to see him, and the Beatles even opened for him while he was selling out stadiums in London and Paris. Back home Richard had to fight for basic recognition, even though he helped shape rock and roll. When the Grammy Awards began in 1959, he wasn't even nominated, even though he had already changed the music world. It took him almost 40 years to finally receive a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1993. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame recognized his contributions in 1986, but Richard had to fight for years for credit before that happened. He had seen white artists like Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis get endless praise. At the 1988 Grammy Awards, Richard famously said, "I am the architect of rock and roll. I am the originator." It was a moment of both pride and frustration for him. He knew he had laid the groundwork for rock, but history kept ignoring him. However, Richard has been honored many times in recent years. In 2015, he received the Rapid and Rhythm Award from the National Museum of African American Music. This award meant a lot to him because it recognized him as one of the pioneers who opened doors for others. Even after he stopped performing because of health issues like heart problems, hip surgery, and getting older, his music didn't go away. It kept showing up in movies so that new generations could hear it. Movies like Green Book, 2018, and Casino, 1995, featured his songs, showing that his sound still had power long after he left the stage. But Richard wasn't just a musician, he was a cultural icon. His crazy personality, flashy clothes, and unstoppable energy made him stand out even after he spoke out against racism in the music industry, saying that black artists had been underpaid and taken advantage of for years. He wasn't afraid to tell it like it was. He knew how the business worked and wanted people to remember who really created rock and roll. When he died on May 9, 2020, tributes from some of the biggest names in music like Paul McCartney and Mick Jagger showed that he wasn't just respected, his music was everywhere. Long Tall Sally was used in Predator 1987, blasting in the background as soldiers flew into battle. It gave the scene energy and attitude, just like Richard's music always did. In Casper 1995, he wrote a song for the ending called Casper the Friendly Ghost, showing that he could adapt his style to anything. In Casino 1995, Slippin' and Sliding made the moment between Robert De Niro and Sharon Stone feel even more intense. In Green Book 2018, Lucille helped bring Commercials used his music to remind everyone of his place in rock history. His songs weren't just old hits, they were still shaping culture, even in his later years. Richard stayed larger than life. His flashy clothes, wild hairstyles, and over-the-top performances had influenced generations. Prince, one of the biggest pop stars of all time, took a lot of style ideas from Richard, even when he couldn't perform anymore. When he died at age 87, he left an indelible mark on the music world. They lost a man who helped make rock and roll sound. His music, style, and fight for fairness are all things that people still care about today.